snowstorms. So without further ado, please welcome John Marty. Good Vikings fans there. I'll try the microphone. Maybe I don't need it, but I'll try it if you can hear okay, if that helps. Anyway, I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm really excited about the great candidates you have locally. I want to start by saying, something that's pretty obvious, and we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but times when people ask me how I'm doing, I say, other than politically, I'm doing great. And there's a lot of truth to the fact. I mean, when Donald Trump won, which, again, one of the candidates asked how many thought that was going to happen, I don't think we realized, first of all, I think many of us didn't think it was going to happen. It was too horrible to imagine, and nevertheless it happened. And Donald Trump is sort of the opposite of everything we want in a human being, everything the opposite of what we want as a political leader. And I think it's pretty clear that literally and figuratively he's building walls between people. And that's something we've got to speak out and fight against and so on. But I also don't think that we get anywhere if we spend all of our time talking about what's wrong with them. I know I can say a lot of really bad things about our Republican legislature or the U.S. Congress and so on, president, and they're true. And in DFL circles, we can get lots of applause for that. What I fear is, in these very divisive times, we don't get that far by saying what's wrong with the other side. And sometimes we forget to acknowledge that we may be ourselves sometimes contributing to some of the division as well. And that the way we move around it is not by spending our time attacking and criticizing. And I'll say that it's not just the people in office, and not just the fact that the Republicans are controlling things that should scare us. This past September, there was a paper published by the National Academies of Science, talked about the fact that they were talking about climate change. And these two scientists, one of them was Californian, the other one I'm not sure from where, but they wrote a paper on the risk of how bad things might be. If you recall, the Paris climate talks talked about we have to, at all costs, we have to stop the climate change of 2 degrees Celsius, because that would be so bad we can't imagine it. So we've got to hold climate change to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. But these two reporters were talking about, these two scientists were talking about how there's a lot of variation. We don't know. We're shocked at how fast the Arctic is warming up. Things do not happen. Some places, Europe, if climate change occurs, will actually get much colder because the Gulf Stream will go away. Huge changes in the way things work, and they're saying we don't know what the details are going to be, how bad the risk is. They know it's bad, they know it's scary, they can show you all that. But they made an estimate of that there was a 1 in 20 chance of having 5 degrees Celsius climate increase by the year 2100, by the end of this decade. Kids who are born this year will be senior citizens, of course, but they'll still be alive. And we'll have a 1 in 5 chance of what they call beyond catastrophic. They suggested what 3 degrees Celsius would mean would be catastrophic. Beyond catastrophic, they said most species would die out, and they were talking about all species, including the human species. And one of the scientists said, to put that into perspective, would you buckle your grandchildren into an airplane seat if you knew there was a 1 in 20 chance of the airplane crashing? And it's kind of scary to see what we're up against, and here we're tinkering around and not really doing much. So when you look at some of the people in office, and number one, things weren't great before Donald Trump took office. They've certainly, I'll just say one more thing about him, and that is that the most powerful ad I saw in the last campaign was the one of these 10 and 12-year-old kids watching Trump's speeches, with just open eyes, and the tagline was, "Remember, our kids are watching." And so I'm not going to spend any more time on Donald Trump or what's wrong with the Republicans or anything else, but say, what do we do? How do we respond? And if you're like me, and I think most of you probably are, there are times when you get discouraged. I've been in the state senate now for 31 years. I just told Buzz that I think of myself as one of the newcomers. I'm second in seniority now, so I guess I'm not. But there are lots of times I've won a lot of fights that people said I could never win. Some of them happened in my first year there. Some of them took 20 years to happen. But how do you keep from getting discouraged or depressed or anything else? And the way I'll say we should respond to these tough times, what I suggested right after Trump's election was the first thing we have to do is stand together with, wrap our arms around, and surround with love and support the people who are victims, who are going to be bashed by the hatred out there. People of color, immigrants, people with different religious beliefs, people with disabilities, LGBTQ community. We got to stand around and support with love the people who might get kicked out of the country, everything else. And that is essential to do, and that's what we as human beings care about. I noticed as an ELC Lutheran that the Lutheran bishops of Minnesota last week put out a very powerful statement rebuking and condemning President Trump's what they call vile and racist remarks about immigrants. We have to surround the people who are scared and give them support. The second thing we have to do is not spend our time criticizing, but fighting against anything bad that's trying to be done. The tax bill that happened a couple weeks ago was a disaster. It really is, when you think about it, what they're doing and the games they're playing with this and so on. People in the middle, people at the bottom are going to be the hardest hit. People at the top are going to be doing better. And they really don't need to do better if better means more money in their pockets. They do much better as people, as a society, if we take care of each other. And when we talk about where things ought to be and where things started out being, remember that 60 years ago now, during the Eisenhower administration, not any raging radical, the top U.S. income tax rate was 91%. You earn $100 more if you're earning $1 million a year kind of category back then. You earn $100 more, you're paying $91 of it in taxes. And of course, there are deductions and other things, so maybe they're not paying that much. But think what that would mean for Jeff Bezos and Amazon and all the others who are billionaires, young billionaires who get it very quickly. We want to reward them for their work, but you know, if they had 1/10 of their billions of dollars, they'd be so obscenely rich we couldn't imagine. But why can't we talk about a fair tax policy? Why are we scared to talk about that? We have to fight hard against the bad stuff that happens. In healthcare, what they're talking about doing, their, whatever they called their health, American Health Plan last summer, which fortunately died, what it was basically was gutting Medicare. It's interesting, they hate the Affordable Care Act, but they were trying to put Medicare into an Affordable Care Act kind of structure where you would buy insurance, they give you vouchers to help subsidize and everything else. But when they're gutting Medicaid and Medicare and like in Minnesota Care and the Affordable Care Act premiums, when they're gutting all of that stuff and basically channeling all the money into tax cuts, which is what the point of it was. That was the biggest single change of that healthcare reform, which wasn't anything about healthcare, it was about cutting taxes. When you look at that, we have to speak out. We have to speak out very, very clearly, and we don't back down. And we got to keep strong for doing that. But the third thing we have to do, and that is, instead of spending our time criticizing, instead of spending our time arguing against, while we are fighting to stop bad things, remember that at least part of the best defense is a good offense. And what we should be doing, instead of spending our time criticizing, is articulating a vision. What kind of a world do we want to live in? I suggest that, you know, I've now been, as I said, in the legislature 31 years, and I can tell you the last time we increased welfare benefits, which is not a popular term to use because people hate welfare. They want to take care of others, but, well, they know welfare is not going to people who need help. Anyway, a grant for single parent with one child, I think, has been $438. For 32 years, it hasn't changed once. Not once. That's obscene. Democrats have been in control a couple of those years, not a lot of them where we've had all three branches, but it hasn't gone up once because we're afraid to talk about that. I've got a bill out there that I think would do a lot to end poverty and make our economic system fair. It would be a $300 a month increase in all welfare grants. That wouldn't bring us fully up to where it ought to be, but it would certainly make life better for kids who are struggling because their parents don't have enough money. It would raise the minimum wage, phase it in, basically what the 15 now folks in Minneapolis are trying to do statewide over 5 years. Smaller businesses would have less than that. And when I heard from the Minneapolis people, they asked if I wanted to write a commentary about how they like, when they're saying, hey, we can't just take one city out, we should do it statewide, and say, hey, why don't you join my bill? Mine would do it statewide. But I said, I called them up and said, mine's not really 15 now. Mine's 15 over 5 years because I don't think you could do it now. I think it'd be too much of a shock. Every small business, you couldn't make it. It's too much of a shock in the economy. But what we did over the last several years with that last minimum wage increase, you keep increasing it, 75 cents an hour or so, and you bring it up. And you have to change the economy that way. You have to do it. One reason the state couldn't afford a $15 an hour minimum wage is because we pay a lot of people that. Personal care attendants, none of them make $15 an hour. These are the people who devote their lives to caring for others. And the state is the one who pays 100% of those wages. So if we were to raise it, we'd have to put more money into that. And wages alone can't bring people out of poverty. The bill would increase the earned income tax credit would more than double it, which gives another couple $100 to a low-income working family. Would fully fund sliding fee child care, meaning the rates would go up, there'd be no waiting list, and everybody would qualify. And that kind of bill, it would be funded by closing a loophole at the top end, very big loophole, and some wouldn't call it a loophole, but it's the kind of thing that some people said, Children's Defense Fund said, yeah, that's a vision bill, for a vision for the way things ought to be. I said, no, it's not. It's a thing that we really ought to be fighting for now, because that doesn't take care of all the inequities, all of the unfairnesses. That doesn't make us a society like they have in many of the Scandinavian countries, where nobody is in poverty, nobody is homeless, no kids are struggling, nobody's without health care. Those are the kind of things we ought to articulate, and we ought to mean it. And when we are in power, we ought to be fighting for that. And I'm going to spend a few minutes yet talking about health care, because as they tear apart our system, as they continue to make it worse, we're going to have to change. We're going to have to do something better. I've been trying to articulate to people that what we've got is a system that is bankrupting businesses, it's bankrupting nonprofits and school districts, it's bankrupting families and government. Warren Buffett used colorful terms last year when speaking to his Berkshire Hathaway shareholder meeting. He said, healthcare is the tapeworm of the American economy, which is a very graphic thing about how it's eating away at it. He says the business community, and he's obviously a very successful businessman, he says business community is always complaining about corporate taxes. He says, I understand, and so he says, in the 1960s, it was about 4% of our gross national product. Now it's about 2%, and they're complaining. He says, healthcare in the 1960s was 5% of our GDP. Now it's 17%. 1 out of every $6 in the economy is going to healthcare. And the projections are by 2025, it'll be 1 out of every $5. It will be 20% of our economy within 7 years now. And we're spending twice what any other country on the planet spends. That's not exactly true. There are about 8 or 10 exceptions, and they spend a lot less than us, but they spend more than half. But we don't think we can take care of it. We're wrapped up in all these clever, creative reforms. We think maybe, and I've served on a lot of the healthcare task forces we've had. Good people on them. But there have been 13 or 14 of them in the last 30 years appointed by either governors or legislators. 13 or 14 task forces. You put every recommendation they put in place, and assuming most of them were good, even if you did every one of them, we're not getting anywhere. we're not getting close. Part of the reason most of the reforms we've tried nationally and in Minnesota have been based on the fact if something is too expensive, what do? We buy less of it. The obvious answer. And so we try and make healthcare more difficult to get. HMOs use networks. A number of years ago, they started this where, oh, you can only go to these doctors or these clinics or whatever. You can't choose your providers as much. That cut back some. Then they tried co-payments and deductibles, and that worked. So they tried more co-pays and more deductibles. They have prior authorization. What's that mean to those who aren't familiar with it? It means your doctor has to get prior approval before they give you certain treatments. We're at a wonderful stage now where diabetics, in some cases, need to get prior authorization to get their insulin every 6 months. I mean, talk about bizarre. But all these things have been designed to make it more difficult to get healthcare, and they've worked. We do go visit the doctor less than people in other countries. We definitely do. But we're still spending twice what anybody else spends on healthcare. I suggest that should raise two questions. The moral question, what kind of a society really wants to make healthcare more difficult for its own people to get? Maybe if you hate some other country, which I'm not advocating for, hate some other, oh, I hope they deny their people healthcare. Kind of like we decide, maybe we should decide education's expensive. Maybe we should say that those kids don't deserve education. We don't need everybody to go to kindergarten. We could do those things, but that's the moral question. We don't want to do that. The economic question is, if you try something for that long and it's not working, maybe you should try a new approach. Maybe you should try a simple approach, an approach of actually figuring out the way the rest of the economy works. Some people say we got to get rid of our fee-for-service system because it's driving up healthcare costs. Because doctors are paid for everything they do, and so they want to do more things. I say that's not a very good theory. First of all, 98, 99% of our economy is based on the concept of fee-for-service or price per product. That's the way we do things. And we can find other ways to pay for it, and we keep trying all these creative approaches, all of which require more administrators and more bureaucracy and more hassle. But we're going to do that because maybe we'll find a way to make it cheaper. By spending more money on administrative costs, it'll bring down the healthcare costs. We won't waste as much money. And you know, if we let people and their doctors make medical decisions, they're going to want the gold standard. They're going to want, we even call the one tax in the Affordable, the Cadillac tax. They're all going to want the best care possible. You know, I always tell people, there's a commentary in today's or yesterday's strip that actually quoted a line I've been saying, how, you know, a caring, compassionate society believes that all of its people ought to have police and fire coverage. And shouldn't a compassionate, caring society also want to make sure everybody has health and dental coverage as well? And the commentator was sort of saying, well, that's bizarre, though, because that's not a good analogy, because police and fire, we try and use that very rarely. We don't want to have a lot of police and fire needs. And I was going to say, and healthcare is different? How many of you would say, if I found out you had next Friday morning off, I'm going to say, why don't you go get another colonoscopy? There's so much. It doesn't work that way. Most of us, we like our doctors, we like our nurses, but we don't like to go see them. We really don't. We want to get no more care than we need. But we set this entire system designed to make sure it's hard for people to get health care. And we somehow think we can't afford to cover everyone. My premise is healthcare costs have got to come down, and the smartest way to do it is get rid of all the confused bureaucratic mess we've got, deliver healthcare as efficiently as we can, and make it available to everyone, with patients and their providers making the decisions, not government, not insurance companies, not employers, but having people in their doctors and their providers make the decisions. Because frankly, most people, if providers have time to talk with people, late in life things, does somebody who's near death and stuff need a new hip or knee replacement? Do they need some major heart surgery? Maybe so, but most of the time, if you have those conversations between patients and providers, they don't do that. They choose the simpler thing. And I'd say all the evidence empirical evidence from around the world and all the economic studies in this country say if you provide health care directly, it's cheaper. And so why can't we be in favor of it? Well, you know, it doesn't have a chance. That's the first thing I heard. And I got to say that I think this is one of the areas we get hope. And I'll wrap it up in a minute, but I want to say one of the ways I think, this may sound strange, but the reason I suggest we might have hope is when there was a bill, a single-payer bill, universal health care bill introduced in the U.S. Senate this past year. I think it's probably the first time since Paul Wellstone introduced them many years ago. There were 16 Democratic co-sponsors, a third of all the Democrats in the Senate. Wildly enthusiastic support. No, I don't mean to bring in a personality because of other things happening in the meantime, but one of our U.S. senators signed on to the bill, and he said, and I like him, and this is not meant as criticism, but it was his wildly enthusiastic comments. He said, well, you know, Paul Wellstone used to introduce this bill, and it's something we ought to think about as an option. Wild enthusiasm. No, well, why wasn't it enthusiastic? Why was it just saying, well, you know, we ought to consider it? Because he's scared of it. We as politicians, including those of you who are running for office, it's tendency to be scared because the public might not believe what we believe. I always think you're better off standing for what you believe in because I think the public may, even if they don't agree with you, as Paul Wellstone often found out, well, he's too liberal for me, but you know, he's fighting for the little guy. And you can trust him and he's brutally honest. And people vote for a whole lot of reasons. But I think you can persuade people if you've got an idea. Why else would you be out there except persuading, fighting for something you believe in? But these U.S. senators, well, why didn't they want to do it? Well, why did they sign on if they weren't that enthused? Well, because what are you for? Well, we're going to defend the Affordable Care Act. Well, yeah, but that's what we got now and we're having problems with it. You can't be, that doesn't get you anywhere. You have to say what you're for, and here's a plan out there that really would work, but they're scared of it. Why? I can tell you they are afraid, and I didn't have a chance to talk to Senator Franken about before he left office or anything, but what I would have advised him is you went way out on a limb, you thought, in order to say you supported this. Not enthusiastically, but you went way out on a limb. Why? Because you're afraid they're going to call you a socialist for supporting it. And they would. I'll guarantee you he would be attacked, anybody who signs on it will be attacked as a socialist. And I would have told him further, you know, what did they call you when you signed on to the Affordable Care Act? A socialist. Even though the Heritage Foundation is the one who came up with the insurance mandate concept behind the Affordable Care Act, even though Mitt Romney first put it in place in Massachusetts. It was socialism they attacked him for. Oh, but they'll attack him more fiercely now. No, if they had $10 million, they'd spend $10 million and throw everything they can at it. If they had $20 million, they'd throw $20 million. They'll still continue to do that. So the attacks aren't going to get any worse. And I can guarantee you, I don't care what corner of the state you're in, what corner of the country you're in. If you go out there and say, it's time to say, we don't need a convoluted patchwork insurance system, we need health care for everyone. If a politician says, well, we ought to at least consider health care for everyone, you know what they get? It's an applause line. And frankly, we politicians like applause. So you start, instead of timidly saying, well, yeah, I signed on to it, it's something we ought to consider. About time, and they cheer. So next time you say, yeah, I support it. And more cheering. And you say it louder, and more cheering. And I think that that actually could change the way the Democratic Party speaks about these things. I think it could actually change election results. And I think the one thing we've noticed with Minnesota Health Plan, we have, I think even now with less than 100 legislators, DFL legislators, we have over 60 co-authors. Again, many of them aren't that enthusiastic, but they're at least on the bill. The ones who we had the easiest time getting were the ones from greater Minnesota. Why? Because things are worse out here. And people understand that. And I think one of the reasons that Donald Trump carried much of greater Minnesota was people are scared. If you're paying more for your health care than you're paying for your mortgage or your rent, if you are struggling to pay the bills, you're scared. And if we as a party are saying, yeah, but we're going to keep working to improve the system, And the other party, maybe it's full of lies, but the other party is saying, we're going to throw out this stuff and start over. If you're desperate, you grab for anything. And I don't want to think, I would be discouraged, deeply discouraged, if I thought that the people in this country who voted for Donald Trump believed what Donald Trump believed, but I don't. I think a lot of them may be very misguided. They may have racism in their beliefs. They may have dislike for others. They may have a lot of fear in them. But I kind of think the way we build a society is not by spending our time bashing them, but by saying, here's what I'm about. Here's who I am and what I care about. And isn't that the same kind of thing you want? And the one thing that's very heartening to me about tonight is to hear all the local candidates talking that way, because I think that's what we need to see. And whether it's for school board or House district or Congress, we've got some people who out there who are going to do it, and I think that that's going to surprise people. We're not going to win elections by trying to say we're less bad than them and point out all the flaws. We're going to win elections by saying here's who we are and what kind of people we want to be. And I'll close with one quick illustration of this, because it's very scary to talk about some of these issues. 1999, Jesse Ventura's biggest tax cut in state history. It was a Republican House, so you knew it was going to pass there. Ventura supported it, so you knew it was going to pass. Senate was DFL, so maybe we had a chance there. It passed 65-1. I was the only no vote on it. It was popular. Tax cuts are popular. I argued, I wrote a commentary for the Strib and for my local papers, arguing why I thought it was so unfair and so bad. But I was scared. I'm not some fearless guy doing all this stuff. I was scared about it. And all candidates tend to be afraid of speaking out because we know we could lose. And we can. But I kind of think that if you want to build a democracy, you stand up with the courage of your convictions. And I like to tell people that if the progressive movement of today, which I'd say all of us, and myself included, are a part of, if we were in charge in earlier eras, we wouldn't be doing too well. If we were in charge during the abolition movement, the 1850s, I would argue we'd still have slavery, but we'd have limited the slaves to working 40-hour work weeks. And we'd be so proud of the progress we made, we'd forget we still had this ugly thing called slavery. We were in the 1930s, depths of the Depression, seniors dying in poverty. Somebody comes up with a real clever name. We're good at clever names these days. Social Security. We're going to take care of seniors and people with disabilities. We're going to take care of them because it's the right thing to do. We'd say, yeah, we got to do it. We'd have bumper stickers and signs campaigning for Social Security. We'd march in parades. But if we were in charge, I'm afraid what we'd have is a pilot project. We'll pick 5,000 people in every state, and they can all have Social Security. Because, you know, they were in a depression. They didn't have any money. But somehow they thought, maybe it's worth doing. And I like to believe that we as people who are really smart people, who really care deeply about others, that we can rebuild this kind of society. Because I want to come back here in a few years and see that this district is a Democrat in Congress, Ian, that this has legislative districts, both the House districts and the Senate seat are DFL. And I know that seems light years away, but things change faster than people can imagine. And I gotta say, the one thing I don't want you to do is give up hope, because the only way you can win is if you stand for what you believe and you fight for what you believe, because that's how we win. That's what life is about, and that's why we're here. And I'm pleased to be with you tonight. Thank you very much.